Kicking off the list at number 10, eye patches. Okay, perhaps one of the most notable features of a pirate has to be the old eye patch. If you're a pirate for Halloween and you don't have the eye patch, well, you just look like a hipster. Like, what are you? We don't know. It matters. It's a noticeable detail. But why did so many pirates cover their eyes? Was it because they got poked by Blackbeard? No. You know when you get up in the middle of the night to go to the washroom, and then as soon as you turn the light on, you're blinded for a hot minute, you can't even see, your ears are ringing, you don't even know where you are? It takes your eyes 20 minutes to adjust to darkness, so pirates having to go from the deck to under the ship back and forth, they had to keep one eye in the dark. Or else they'd be covering their eyes for most of their shift, which you really can't have when you're running a tight ship. Nobody has the time for that, so cover your eyes and be blind half the time.
At number 9, earrings. When you think about what a stereotypical pirate looked like, you probably think of tattered clothing, hats, maybe an eye patch, and earrings. While their style, though pretty odd, also had a purpose, specifically the earring. Pirates were very superstitious, and their earrings followed in their superstitions as well. There were a lot of different beliefs that pirates had about these earrings. Some pirates believed that it could somehow improve or even cure bad eyesight. Why? No clue. Maybe they thought that ears and eyes were connected or something. I mean, they do start with the same letter. Some pirates also believed that the precious metals that their earrings were made of possessed magical healing powers, so maybe that's why they believed that they would heal their eyes. They also thought that having pierced ears would help them with seasickness, and that having a gold earring would serve as some kind of protective talisman, and that if you wore one, you would be protected from drowning.
Now, as mentioned, Roman emperors had some more really than a little say in marriage. So, number 8 is all about how it was governed by law. There were very specific laws governing marriage, and these laws evolved depending on the era, the emperor in control, and then when Christianity entered the empire. Pretty consistently, a proper Roman marriage could not take place unless the bride and the groom were Roman citizens or had been granted special permission called a connubium. So, more on the laws around that in a later point. At one time in Roman history, those who had been owned people, now freed, were forbidden to marry citizens. This restriction was relaxed by an Emperor Augustus who passed a reform in 18 BC called the Lex Julius, so that, by the 1st century, freed peoples were only prohibited from marrying senators. Augustus instead insisted on other restrictions on marriage. Citizens weren't allowed to marry working girls or actresses, and provincial officials were not allowed to marry local women. Soldiers were only allowed to marry in certain circumstances, and marriages to close relatives were forbidden. Finally, unfaithful wives divorced by their husbands could not remarry. In the Republic, there was a stipulation that if the bride is, not deflowered, her husband should only sleep beside her for at least one night without engaging in physical touch. The aim of that was to give women a chance to get used to a new situation. Another thing meant to help her get used to a new situation, number 7, the mutinus tutinus. So, we know about this tradition through some very, very angry church fathers and their many documented temper tantrums. One famous account is Christian apologist Arnibus, who angrily scribbled that the Roman matrons were taken for a ride on Tutinus with its immense shameful parts. In reality, what he's actually describing, with a lot of hostility and hypocrisy as an obscene loss of purity, was actually a ritual that allowed brides to have autonomy and learn not to be embarrassed by the act of intercourse and their bodies' role in it, in an era where that didn't get to happen. So stop being mad, bro, it can't always be about men. The ritual goes that before the consummation of her marriage, a Roman woman had to go through the process of deflowering herself. In order to do that, she made her way to the temple of Mutinus and the marriage deity and sat on his appendage. She didn't have to do more than a quick sit if she didn't want to. It was up to the woman. Some wanted to do the sit down, ouch, okay, time to get up and leave, got lots of wedding planning to do, while other women would, you know. So whatever kind of woman you are, once you walked out of that temple, albeit now a little bit bow-legged, you were also now able to have proper relations with your new husband. And a deity being your first penetration would guarantee fertility and healthy children. As also mentioned previously, their society aimed for women not to have relations on the first night anyways, and rather sleep beside their husband. Unfortunately, both these practices degenerated and took women's rights with them. We've done a lot of build up to it, so let's make number 6 all about how Roman weddings have one wacky ceremony. First of all, a marriage ceremony was commonly held, although there was actually no legal requirement for such. In law, all that was required was for the bride to be led to the groom's house. The groom did not have to show up. He could quite literally be wed in absentia via a letter of intent. There's some confusion about which rituals relate to which types of marriage and from what time periods, seeing as there was 3 kinds of marriage and a lot of different eras of the Roman Empire. Purchase, which is the usual, it's always existed. Usage, super archaic, where a man and woman could spend a year together unmarried, do whatever they want, and once it's hit the 1-year point, if the woman stays another 3 days, they're officially married. Then one last came into play later in the empire, and that was alongside Christianity. It had a religious character involved. In earlier times, either a lamb was sacrificed and its skin spread out for the bride to sit on, or a sow was sacrificed to Mother Earth. Either route, an auspex read the entrails to determine the fate of the couple. Then the bride unveiled herself, power move, and the couple stood face to face. In later times, when vows were introduced, she would say, "Where you are the male, I am the female," and he would respond, "Ubi tu Gaia, ego Gaius." Rings or coins were then given to the bride. A contract was signed if was desired, like a prenup agreement today. Both families could stipulate terms around children and in finances, such as a dowry. The Roman marriage ceremony, called a dextratum incutio, literally means joining of hands. The last component found in all times of the empire was a handshake that signifies the concordia, a mutual bond of affection between the married couple using their right hands. The couple then share a ritual spelt cake that the groom broke above the bride's head, not like a bottle style, in a "let me crumble this above your elaborate hairstyle to feed your head lice" kind of way. And then after the wedding comes the domum deductio, number 5. So it's a big old procession and the most important part of the wedding day, signifying a public acknowledgement of the wedding. The procession could begin at the bride's family's hearth with a ritual where she would be pulled from her mother's arms and a demonstration of the bride's modesty and sadness of leaving the family home. The entire procession then paraded to the groom's house, and the bride specifically was escorted by 3 younger men, one carrying a torch and the other 2 would be holding her arms. They are followed by the pronuba, 5 white pine torches that are carried to honor Ceres, an earth fertility goddess. The bride then has a bouquet of distaffs or spindles to nod to her duty as a wool maker for the family. Then would come the couple's friends and family behind them. Anyone else could join the procession, and many people did just for fun, all while throwing candied nuts at the bride. The groom received the bride at the door, which she entered with the distaff and spindle in hand, and at the threshold the bride adorned the doorway post with the fat of a pig to honor Ceres, the fat of a wolf to honor Rome, and then remember those raw wool strips all up in her hair? They get added to the door too. After she's finished her arts and craft project, the husband would present her the household keys. In pagan times, she'd do a consent chant, then he'd sweep her up and carry her in the doorway since tripping was a bad omen. Guests were invited in for a meal and only left when it was time to undo Hercules' knot. Like levels in a video game, now outside the bedroom door, the groom presents the bride fire and water, the elements of the household maintenance. The bride touches each, and then her husband would undo the knot, even if fortification wasn't to occur, and just like that, you're married. And you may be wondering how to congratulate the happy couple. Well, don't worry, because that's number 4 in the countdown. So, as mentioned, if you're hanging around in a procession, whether part of the wedding party or just an everyday Joe, you get to hug handfuls of dried candied fruits and nuts at the bride. Walnuts were most popular for this, which I feel would be the worst kind of nut to get stuck in your hair, but maybe getting a dried apricot thrown at you and bouncing off your cranium isn't much better either. As I'm sure you can tell, this was the cultural precursor to throwing rice, confetti, and bits of paper, which probably resulted in fewer brides with eye injuries. As an attendee, you can yell feliciter, which means good luck, or talisio, which even in the times of the late Republic was an archaic word. There were most definitely obscene songs. Naturally, they were sung by men and children in the procession. On my personal favorite, this little hand sign. This is mano fico, representing good luck, fertility, protection from the evil eye. However, in modern Italian culture, it's evolved into an intercourse-based insult, so don't go busting it out at weddings. Now here's a question I've heard a few times, and I love answering stuff. So, who can marry who is number 3. If you went back in time and asked a Roman their perspective on interracial marriage, they'd be so confused by your question they'd probably miss the fact that you're wearing Air Maxes. Fun fact, kids, but most of those ancient worlds didn't have our racial categories. A Briton and Assyrian, African and Romanian, Caribbean and Native American? What's Latin for whatever's, yo? Because they didn't regard such things as fundamentally wrong the way that modern crappy people can. The evidence seems to show that ethnicity played a little part once a group was Romanized. If they acted, dressed, and behaved as a Roman, then to most, they were a real Roman. That meant you could marry another Roman. Don't even ask me about same-sex relationships because those were laughably normal. But hear what I mentioned, Roman and Roman. That's because the big Roman taboo was class mixing. A great example is how a barbarian and a Roman citizen couldn't marry, not on the grounds of race mixing or same genders, but actually on pure legality. Marriage had to be between two Roman Empire citizens. Barbarians, who were anyone living in the regions around Rome but not part of the Roman Empire, did not have connubium, which is aka the right to specifically marry Roman citizens. This applied to even the Greeks, who were held above the other barbarians for being similar enough to the Romans. If a marriage between a Germanic and a Roman tried or did successfully happen, man, y'all could be beige, pink, black, green, blue, boys, girls, all in between. It's a scandal, one that could be subjected to a court case or even a death sentence. Let's talk about number 2, the Roman divorce. Prior to the late Republic, divorce was virtually unknown. Changes in marriage laws allowed for women to keep control of her dowry, and this made divorce and self-sustenance more viable option for women. And it was also simple. Just so simple. Just as a marriage was only a declaration of intent to live together, as mentioned, really all that's necessary is a procession to the groom's house, divorce was just a declaration of the couple's intent not to live together. All that law required was that they declare their wish to divorce before 7 witnesses. An ex-wife could expect to receive her dowry back in full and then return to her father's possession. If she'd been independent before the wedding, i.e. orphan, freed woman, she would regain her independence. Under the Lex Julia, founded by Augustus, a wife found guilty of adultery in special court might sacrifice the return of half her dowry, and it allowed her dad to kill her, or just about any man. Really creepy. Divorce for infertility, always assumed to be the woman's fault, was valid given that bearing children was pretty much the point of the marriage thing, and also political advancement was another valid reason for divorce. In the late Republic, Cato the Younger divorced his wife Marcia so that she could marry someone else and he could forge links with the orator Quintus Hortensius, the only way he could climb in rank. Cato loved Marcia and missed her deeply, so when Hortensius dies a few years later, Cato was now a high-ranking man and remarried his now very rich ex-wife. The last and the craziest on the list is number 1. Where did it all come from? All these traditions, all these centuries. Roman weddings have had some of the most influence on traditions we still have today. Even the language, like tying the knot. But I have to come to bear some horrible, horrible origins for all of these traditions. The taking of Sabine women. The story is set when the village of Rome was first established in 753 BCE. Its population was almost entirely men, with only a small handful of already married women who are now too scared to leave their home. So, what's the answer to prehistoric evil men? Steal women of childbearing age from the neighboring township of Sabine. These girls are then forced into marriages through physicality. So when their fathers and brothers and previous husbands come to wage war and retrieve their women, the women are now mothers and throw themselves between the evil men who are now the fathers of their children and then the men who they'd been stolen from, their family. Historians say this is because women supposedly felt so much guilt over the bloodshed that started in their names and wanted to live neither fatherless nor widowed. So truce is called, and the Sabines and the Romans unite their community. There's a lot to be said here about motives for consent, notions of honor and family, female trauma, and the history being very obviously written by a man. So, for now, let's focus on the fact that many Roman weddings refer to this legendary empire-shaping event. The hairstyle of 6 braids. It's parted with a spearhead to represent the violent capture of the Sabines, pulling the daughter from her mother's arms, and her family, taking her away in a procession to her new husband's home. Women carried across the threshold to avoid tripping, a bad omen. It's a reference to Sabine women being forcibly carried or dragged into their captors' homes. Plutarch gave more explanation to the meaning of that wedding word, thalasio, including the fact that it's named on one of the Sabine abductors and wool related, thus all the wool necessary in the wedding and the scraps being left around his front door. All of these traditions are incorporated into ancient Roman weddings after the atrocity united communities to try and ritualize the event that joined the two nations and create a bond from it, rewriting the tragedy into unity and celebration. And now, we still do some of these things today.
Kicking off our list at number 10, afterlife servant. Ancient Egyptians were closely connected to the afterlife, or at least they tried to be. After a loved one passed, ancient Egyptians would ensure that they have everything that they needed in the living world as well in the afterlife, right? Every valuable belonging, everything that you held dear to you your entire life, ideally that's what you want to take to the other side, right? And that also included, sadly, lifelong servants. These masters were thinking about their necessities in the afterlife, and of course, being otherwise useless without their servant, they have to bring them too. Now, I know what you're thinking, right? That would probably suck for the other guy, right? Yeah, it did. It really did. Someone dies, now you gotta go too. You're like, what? Forced to be a literal ride or die. That is impossibly unfair. That's ancient Egypt for you. This tradition thankfully changed before many of these famous pharaohs that we know were put into power. So it didn't last forever, this horrible theme, this idea, but it did happen a lot. Famous pharaohs came into power and this tradition underwent a change, but eventually this practice led to the introduction of number 9. The Shabti. The Shabti were tiny carved figurines that would often be placed inside of these tombs of the pharaohs. Now you've probably seen them at some point and thought that they were just a valued belonging, which obviously they were, but their real purpose was much more grand. These beautiful little works of art were always shaped like mummies, and on each and every Shabti carved into them were special instructions that determined what job they got in the afterlife. Yeah, it's like the world's oldest resume right there.
Number 8 in our countdown is my favorite pun yet. I put that shit on everything.
Except quite literally.
Egyptian doctors used human and animal excrement as a cure-all remedy for diseases and injuries. According to Eber's papyrus recording in 1500 BC, animal feces such as donkey, dog, gazelle, and fly were all celebrated for their healing properties and considered to ward off bad spirits. While we know that Egyptian medicine was incredibly advanced, even having doctors who were specialists, you can't help but question this logic. However, like with most things the Egyptians did, technically they weren't wrong. Research shows that microflora found in some types of animal dung contain antibiotic substances. So sure, you risk some tetanus, but you could also be cured. Lizard blood, dead mice, mud, moldy bread were also all used as topical ointments and dressings, and women were also sometimes dosed with horse saliva as a cure for low libido. And speaking of a woman's libido, man, did the Egyptians have some crazy women's healthcare going on. Number 7, we'll call the fertility games. I have a newfound appreciation for modern medicine after learning a way our ancient Egyptian friends tested fertility was by placing a garlic or onion clove inside of a woman's. This is because ancient Egyptians believed that all orifices of a woman were connected, kinda like subway tunnels. Anyways, if the doctor could smell garlic on your breath the next morning, then the tubes were clear and the woman was fertile. But if the doctor couldn't smell garlic, then the tubes were blocked and it was assumed that the woman couldn't give birth. Once you are pregnant though, you can find out the sex of your baby in another bizarre tradition, popping a squat over some barley. Why? Because if it barely grew, then the baby was a boy. If the barley grew like crazy, then the baby was a girl. This test was believed to be highly accurate, and they weren't wrong in that. Turns out the test was actually accurate in 70% of all cases. And in 1963 lab testing, the urine of a pregnant woman did cause the seeds to sprout. Since she was in fact pregnant with a girl, it's likely the seeds start to grow faster due to elevated levels of estrogen, which stimulates growth. I can think of some truly hilarious ways to integrate this into a gender reveal party. But kids aren't for everyone, and that's okay. Ancient Egyptians were notoriously not fans of them, so let's talk number 6, safe sex. There are actually lots of stories of Egyptian contraceptive methods, but don't get too fascinated because these aren't anything you want to try and recreate. Egyptian women would collect the dung of crocodiles or elephants to mix with sacred herbs and honey. They would then apply this paste mixture to their vulva and up inside the vagina as a protective seal on their genitals. Okay, men, don't think you're getting much better though, as your contraceptive was to rub onion juice all over your junk. If neither of these worked, which shocker if they didn't, the Egyptians had an herb called silphium, which was used to help devoid a woman of an unwanted pregnancy. They even knew what has been confirmed today that achia gum from an achia tree worked as a spermicide and would reduce the likelihood of pregnancy after the fact. While it's impressive they figured out what they did, this whole section just has yeast infection written all over it, so let's just keep going for everybody's sake. Number 5, let's reuse, reduce, and recycle our rotten food. More questionable cure-alls. As I mentioned in point number 8, moldy bread was used by doctors for medical reasons such as medicine or gauzing techniques. This is because Egyptians, from what we can gather, seem to have figured out the antibiotic properties and believed the exposure of mold to a wound would better aid in the immune system for next time, if not at least help quicker healing process this time. But Egyptians also reused other rotten foods. For example, sour milk was also used medicinally. Believed bathing in it would help with skin disease or dryness. I mean, all that sand is bound to have a little bit of a chafy effect. Honey, which also happens to be a natural bacteria killer, may not have been rotten, but it was put on open wounds similar to how we use polysporin today. And while rotten donkey liver may not have been medicine, the Egyptians were quick to slather it on their head and get a nice even dye job. Number 4 in our countdown is a different kind of rotten, the casual neck. The Egyptians were known for their fascination with life, death, and sex. In their beliefs, the god Ra actually created the universe and the first two gods through masturbation. Osiris, another god who eventually came along, became father to Horus posthumously after Isis had sex with his dead body. Ra also had sex with Osiris posthumously, but it seems his use of onion juice worked pretty well and he didn't father any children with the dead body. Now, just because it's in their godly pantheon doesn't mean just anyone was necrophilic in ancient Egypt, but those who were may have had that lust arguably feeling a little more justified in their pursuit of rotten ladies. So, there was an issue with necrophilia towards the deceased bodies of Egyptian women, to the extent that their loved ones began a habit of letting their corpses sit out for 2-3 days before passing them to the embalmers, so as to dissuade sex. The logic was that the embalmers wouldn't want to have sex with a body that was already beginning to rot. I mean, they shouldn't want to have sex with the body in the first place, but I guess beggars can't be choosers. Regardless, embalmers were apparently common enough for the Grecian writer Herodotus, who famously documented a lot of cultures practices, to make special note of. Let's take a break from the funky stuff to talk about a different kind of pussy. Number 3, the obsession with cats. Guys, I am super biased to this one. Don't know if you can notice the fine sheen of cat hair I rep, but I'm with the ancient Egyptians on the cat praise. Ancient Egyptians were obsessed with cats and even worshipped them. Believed to be gatekeepers of the underworld, these little beasts were spiritual and metaphorical symbols for Egyptians, and they were even believed to be gods themselves. The act of harming, eating, or killing a cat warranted a death penalty as a result. And while adoring your family pet isn't bizarre, the effects of worshipping something are. When the family cat died, every member in the household would shave off their eyebrows to mourn its death. And if a building was burning, people would save the cats before they even put out the fire. Being the first society to domesticate cats, Egyptians used cats for extermination aside from the companionship, which worked so well that their agricultural society dominated that of the Mediterranean for hundreds of years. Of course, there were cons to this obsession. For example, when the Persian invaders showed up using cats as shields, the Egyptian army retreated in fear of killing a cat, allowing the invaders to their soldiers and the pharaoh and take over rule of Egypt. Oops. Unlike other animals, cats were often mummified and buried in tombs dedicated to the goddess Bastet. Recovered cat figurines made of wood, stone, and bronze can be found in museums and collections all across the world. Number 2 is a modern day medical emergency, but to ancient Egyptians, it was just his time of the month. While it's astounding that medical accomplishments that Egyptians had made, specialized doctors, antibiotics, even surgery, you can see from their contraceptives in point 6, Egyptians didn't always nail it. In fact, the disease schistosomatosausia, we'll just call it by its second name, bilharzia, was so common that they didn't even realize it was a disease, and it infected nearly everyone. How did it slip under the radar though? The side effects of the disease make people feel sick, and it caused blood in their urine and fecal matter. Seeing as menstruation also came with bloody urine and feeling sick, Egyptians simply thought they were menstruating and came to accept that men had to do the same as women. Blood and urine became a normal part of growing up for boys, and Egyptian society was already very big on gender nonconformity, even having records of sex changes, so this really wasn't outlandish thinking to them. In reality, bilharzia was actually parasitic worms having a field day in their junk. Irregardless, a man peeing blood was even treated as a sign of his fertility. No better sign a man was ready to father a family than being infected with parasites. Man, what a trip this countdown has been. You may be wondering what can take the cake. It's the ceremonial circle in at number 1. So as prior mentioned, ancient Egyptians believed Ra to have created much of life and existence through, well, his masturbatory sessions. This was also believed about the Nile River, Egypt's famous river that flows 6,600 kilometers before it empties into the Mediterranean Sea. These ancient Egyptians believed that the flow of the river represented the frequency of Ra's ejaculations. Seeing as the Nile was the source of Egyptian agriculture, it was incredibly important that that flow remained. Well, it's 4000 BC, and everyday people don't exactly see their gods wandering around. So, with their pharaoh being the personification of God, the duty fell onto him. So, once a year, in the last month of summer, during the festival Min that celebrated the pharaoh's rule, the pharaoh would approach the Nile, remove his robe, and masturbate over the Nile River in a sacred public ceremony. He had a large retinue of men that would also into the river at the same time as him. Once the pharaoh and his men had, well, finished, any man was welcome to unload in the river too. It was believed that these cultural and religious practices would ensure that the Nile would continue to flow for the next year to come, pun intended.
First up at number 10, let's talk about the horrid Roman wedding colors. I mean, they have you out here looking like a McBride. I'm talking Happy Meal. Whoever decided that egg yolk yellow must have been the move must have hated Romans or women or both. So, to paint y'all a picture, picture, the night before her wedding, having given away her childhood dolls, a Roman girl might sleep in a tuncarecca, a special white woolen robe she has to woven herself to demonstrate her domestic skills. If you, let's say, sucked at domestic skills, you'd essentially be wearing like a pillowcase with no arms type of thing. So, on the morning of the wedding day, the bride is dressed by her mother, and everything she wore has to be cream or a yellow wool. It's the only material harvested from an animal while it's still alive, thus it contained animus, aka spirit. This must seem an absolutely brazenly stupid material choice given the Mediterranean climate, but keep in mind it was spun to be supremely Aryan-like. That doesn't make it any less chafy though, so. On to the egg yolk, aka flammium, the flame-colored or color of egg yolk veil used to cover the bride's hair and shielded her face. It signaled the transition into a matron's pala, a huge rectangular shawl worn by wedded women. But before you slap that rain poncho on her head, don't forget to do the elaborate Sunny Creens hairstyle. What's that mean in English? Intercourse creens. It's 6 special braids wound with a bunch of fragrant herbs to do with fertility, but also covers the fact people were smelly. Don't worry, you add more cotton this time to her hair in colorful strips. Last but not least, like your daughter is a present under the tree, you tie her up in a bow. More accurately, a cingulum. It's a wool belt tied with something called a Hercules knot that her husband has to be confident enough to undo on the wedding night. Toss on a pair of neon yellow slippers and you're ready to go down the aisle looking like a crumpled napkin covered in mustard. Let's go. So, marriage required giving up a lot of yourself, including your girlhood. Number 9 is Bye Bye Barbie. As we all know, girls were married off while still young, but to give you like the smallest semblance of peace, many Roman emperors upheld and enforced that consummation wasn't allowed despite a marriage occurring until a woman reached a certain age, just to ensure they didn't die unnecessarily, and childbirth was a major 50-50 back then. Some women were genuinely barred from giving birth well into their 20s if their family had a bad rep of lady deaths. But the night before a wedding, no matter what happened once the knot was tied, pun intended, and no matter her age, a girl set aside dolls, old hairbrushes, and dresses and donned in matronly garb for the first time and ceremoniously burnt her old items. By dedicating her toys and youthful possessions to the household gods, it became a transition in which she would emerge a woman. Even if you're like 20, you had to do this. I'm sure it didn't have to go as far as burning it, like sheesh, maybe save them for when you have a kid of your own, that way you don't have to remake and rebuy all the stuff again. Or find like a prehistoric value village to donate to, maybe. And while we're giving things away, why don't you take a second and scroll on down to the red button below so you can subscribe to the Hive.
Number 8. Column Wars. So while the Greeks were going head to head with the Turks, they were fighting over their independence. Now the Greeks had the upper hand at the Acropolis one day. They were surrounding their enemy, everything was going great, they had this stronghold in their grasp. And the Turks at the same time were running out of ammo and of course options. They then began to break apart the marble columns around them. Yeah, just smashing them to bits like it's Minecraft, just to try and get lead from inside. Now, as the Greeks witnessed the destruction of their Parthenon, they panicked. They were like, please stop. They said, here, take our ammo instead, but don't break our columns. And they did. They took their ammo, continued the war, the 1821 Greek War of Independence. Yeah, here you go, Ottoman Empire. Take this lead. Now we can fight. Let's do it officially. I'd be like, take the columns. We're getting out of here. Peace. Number 7. Zombies? Question mark. Yeah, it doesn't matter the context. Zombies are always scary wherever you drop them in history or culture. Whenever we talk about ancient Egyptians, we break down the process of mummification, and that I miss. Just keep everything in jars, keep everything separate, safe in the middle of a tomb. No zombies coming back to life here. No way, Jose. Well, ancient Greeks, they actually believed in zombies in some way, shape, or form. They had steps that they would take to prevent the dead from ever walking again, which is, okay, terrifying to say out loud. Archaeologists found graves where bodies were actually weighed down with rocks, or they'd be pinned down to their tombs, again, to prevent them from leaving after death. Why is that? Why are you doing that? They weren't called zombies at the time, obviously, but rather they were called revenants. Reanimated corpses that returned to terrorize the living. Nice, sounds a lot like a zombie, doesn't it? Yeah, I agree. Dr. Solosky Weaver explains that bodies found at a cemetery near the ancient town of Camarina in the southeast Sicily, they were feared to come back to life. So the town was once a Greek colony, of course now modern day Italy, but it's home to a 3rd century cemetery with around 3,000 bodies. And more than half of them were buried with coins. So yeah, I wouldn't recommend digging up anything, but just know there's some treasure and zombies possibly lying around you at every waking moment. Cheers. Number 6, stone cold. When the pandemic first began, one of the hardest things to get a hold of was toilet paper. I don't know, everyone decided to their pants or something all of a sudden. It was chaos for no reason. It's pretty important, I guess. When you run out of toilet paper, you often remember that moment for a little while. Regardless of where you are, you'll remember that forever. Start looking around for towels and props. You're like, all right, how am I gonna get out of this sticky situation? Leaves of 3, let them be. That's all I'm saying. But ancient Greeks, they did things a rougher way. Ancient Greeks would use these small ceramic pieces to wipe their bottom. Yeah, ceramic to wipe. Ha! Ow! French anthropologist Philippe Charlier expands on this toilet hygiene history in the British Medical Journey. These flat terracotta discs found in these ancient sites had residue on them. Residue like, yeah. Also, what a lousy find. You're like, oh, I found an ass wipe. I found an ancient ass wipe. Nice, I'm gonna put that in my pocket. They also discovered a Greek cup which said on it, 3 stones are enough to wipe one's arse, which is pretty funny. 3, really? I'm like, guy, I'm like 8 or 9 minimum. Number 5, naked exercise. This next one, look, I'm not saying it's unusual, but maybe I'm on board with this one. I don't know, it looks kind of fun. You ever forget a towel when you shower? You gotta do that naked silly run through the hallway. You feel like a goblin, you feel like Bigfoot just nude in your hallway. That's my favorite run. I feel like the alien from Signs just walking around, just very lanky, you know what I mean? Ancient Greeks used to work out like that. They used to walk around sweaty and naked and then lift some weight. The word gymnasium translates to the Greek term gymnasion, which meant at the time, school for naked exercise. Fun fact right there. Xavier's school for gifted youngsters or Ezekiel's school for naked exercise? How do you pick, right? 50-50. Just don't set up shop behind the guy doing squats. That's gonna be a bad time in the ancient gym. Number 4, wine time. When we think of ancient Greeks, we think of wine and parties and I guess now naked exercise. Sorry about that. But was it really a drunken festival of love all the time? Not really at all. Ancient Greeks actually rarely drank wine without diluting the hell out of it first. The water to wine ratio was 4-to-1. So yeah, you'll be hydrated, that's for sure. Regular Joes would drink at taverns and the rich would throw these big lavish house parties. And some things stayed the same over all these years, but ancient Greeks believed that drinking undiluted wine could cause blindness or insanity. Yeah, I think that's just called blacking out, my friend, but who knows? Number 3, human sacrifice. All right, these last 3 we're gonna get pretty weird. We found the remains of a 3,000-year-old skeleton in Greece, and they found the skeleton on the side of Mount Lycaon, which historians know is the site of animal sacrifice for Zeus. That's a fun place to be. We'll set up a picnic not there. Ancient writers mention this site and how human sacrifice was also at play. And thanks to technology, we can confirm that this is indeed the case. The upper part of the skull was missing and the body was laid on 2 lines of stones with stone slabs laid on the pelvis. So yeah, doesn't look really natural if you ask me. We look at Greece, of course, as the birthplace of philosophy, democracy, and 100-meter hurdles, all that good stuff. But they also did some sacrifice stuff, apparently. Yeah, you don't really learn that in school, don't you? Science has allowed us to look all over the world as well, not just Greece. Ancient Egyptians, Aztecs, the Mayans, oh my god, this one was huge. After Mayan ball games, the losing team would be sacrificed. That would suck. Those are some high stakes right there. I would kind of love to watch that game. That's pretty crazy. Number 2, Greek statues. We've all done it at one point, we gotta admit. You're at a museum, you see a big statue, it's massive. This warrior represented has like 16 abs, he's made of bronze, he's 8 feet tall. The amount of detail got into their body is jaw-dropping, it's impressive. And then you see what they got here and you're like, why is that so small? Why'd they make this part so small and your abs are so big? Did you know ancient Greeks would make their, you know what, small on statues on purpose? Yeah, men who were well endowed, if I can say that, they were more often than not foolish in history. They only ruled for lust. So if you had a big brain instead of a big you were the talk of the town. Ladies would whisper about you as you passed them. Whenever an actor would play a fool on stage, they would be given a comedically large, setup. That's how you knew that he was the villain or the fool back then, because he had a big, I guess. The way we see these statues today meant that they had self-control and intelligence, and it wasn't always about this, right? So whenever you see a big dude with a little statue, that's how you know. He was very noble lad there. Number 1, the Battle of Marathon. Every New Year's, there's always that one guy on Facebook who just becomes a runner. He has the squirt water belt, the whole shit. They train for a marathon, they do it, they tell you about it, they remind you every single day in the office. office. What is a marathon? Was it a person? Is it a name for 42 kilometers? Well, it was actually a battle back in 490 BC. It was a battle between ancient Greeks and Persian invaders sent by King Darius. Now the Persians arrived to Marathon, about 20,000 of them, and they arrived to punish the Greeks for supporting the Ionians, who revolted against the Persians. Now the Greeks were outnumbered, but they attacked hard and fast. They took out 6,000 Persians and eventually they just fled entirely, which would have been my plan from the start. See ya. The number of Greek fighters lost was around 200, so far less casualties. The story of Philippides came to be at this time. He ran the first ever marathon. He ran all the way from, well, the place Marathon to Athens to deliver messages. And that distance was, you guessed it, 42 kilometers. He was one of the Greek military men known as day-long runners. He did 6 marathons back to back every day. Yeah, my knees hurt just reading. We gotta get out of here. They're gonna buckle below me as I'm reading this list.
Let's start at the beginning. How gladiators got going. The notion of gladiators originated with the Etruscans, who preceded the Romans in central Italy. Traditionally, when an Etruscan leader died, as part of the funeral ceremony, a pair of warriors sometimes, fought to the death with their bare hands to honor his warlike spirit. Normal stuff. But over time, this practice becomes institutionalized, and the Romans subsequently imitate it in a more digestible way to them, while simultaneously distancing themselves from the savagery of the Etruscans. Throughout the next 800 years of the Roman Republic, gladiator games remained infrequent on a small scale and only held as part of a funeral service for those of high rank. That practice began to change in the late Republic. Julius Caesar put on a gladiatorial show that featured 320 pairs of gladiators in honor of his father, who'd already been dead for 20 years. Seems like nobody important died recently, and Julius really had a hankering for a gore show. From then on, the gladiator games thrown by him made the younger Caesar popular with the people of Rome. One notable exhibition took place in 216 BC, when 22 fights were held over 3 days to mark the death of a prominent senator. From boo-hoo to yahoo, tradition to entertainment. In ancient Rome, it was tradition for the state to provide entertainment using 2 categories: lude, meaning theatrical performances, dances, and chariot races and other creative pursuits. Then there's monera, or spectacle, such as wild animal shows, death sentences, and other unusual exhibitions. The Romans' concept of entertainment was that most of these events had a religious component, held on religious days, accompanied by prayers and sacrifices, a way of paying homage to the gods. As mentioned, gladiators started out as a weird funerary rite, and Julius segues them into the everyday by having a big melee, so now boom, they're suddenly part of Monera. There is scholarly debate if this is truly from public demand alone, or if the gladiatorial games being used as distractions that kept the people subdued so they were just hardcore promoted in the village. Some argued that the game reflected the typical Roman virtues such as courage, endurance, and martial skill, while others, like Roman satirist Juvenal, thought that the games preyed on the Roman unhealthy obsessions with bread and circuses, aka blood sport. In Rome, death sentences and ritual killings were a way of keeping the peace and showing the Romans who boss was. The arena was the next step, an advancement in societal distraction used to entertain the lower class citizens of Rome, but at the same time uniting them together in an uphold of societal rules. Think this is horrific? May I turn your attention to rugby, hockey, and basketball, 3 sports notorious for hardcore hits and the spilling of blood. Think of audience reaction when a fight breaks out, when a tooth goes flying, when someone lands a dirty hit. Yeah, not so archaic, is it?
Number 8, magic mirrors. Because of horror movies, it's hard for me to open and close a bathroom mirror. I can't do it. They always do it so slow in the movies as well. I'm like, ugh, just slam it. But in ancient China, mirrors were considered a good omen, actually. So much so that after a loved one passed, a mirror was often hung on the ceiling of the burial chambers, to prevent evil spirits from ruining your beauty sleep. If you encountered an evil spirit, the first place you would have to go is near one of these ancient mirrors. So when archaeologists found these 2,000-year-old ancient artifacts, one of these mirrors was still able to reflect images. The world's strongest Windex, there we go. We found more than 80 of these, so it's quite important back in the day. Inscriptions were also left on these mirrors as well, like family wealth, eternal joy, anything to preserve their memory. I would much rather have a giant mirror than a tombstone after I pass away, but it's gotta be a funhouse mirror, because any other mirror is scary. And also, I can't get my hands on these ones. They're slim pickings, only 80 of these.
Number 7, John Wen. This kind of gives off Anastasia vibes a little. A prince thought to be alive after he was destroyed in a fire. In 1402, the Ming capital of Nanjing, a fire was smoldering beneath political strife. The capital was invaded by the emperor's own uncle, Zhu Di. He later accused his own nephew of being corrupted and lying to the people. Finally, the storm that had been brewing for years erupted. A rebellion was launched by his uncle with the aim of getting rid of the emperor's ministers and for Di to take power. He destroyed the palace by fire while the emperor was still inside. 3 bodies were recovered from the wreckage, assumed to be the bodies of Jian Wen, his empress, and their eldest son. His uncle soon declared himself emperor, but the people believed that Jian Wen had escaped. Rumors that he smuggled out just in time and was living as a monk somewhere else in China circulated. His uncle tried to erase any trace of his legacy, but the people remembered, just kind of like anesthesia. Yeah.
Number 6. Ancient seismograph. Zhang Heng, a Chinese astronomer and a mathematician born in 78 AD, created the world's first seismoscope in 132 AD, and it's absolutely weirdly gorgeous. I mean, look at this thing. So what would happen was, Heng figured this out, that when an earthquake hit, this pendulum inside the urn would move, as do most things during an earthquake, and in turn, when it picked up vibrations, it dropped a ball out of the mouth of the ancient metal dragon. The ball then falls into one of the mouths of a metal frog, making a beautiful but concerning clang sound. Now apparently the first time this happened, nobody even felt a thing, but days later, when a messenger finally arrived, it was then told that an earthquake did in fact happen. This type of ancient knowledge blows my mind. Like, this guy changed the world. Not too mysterious per se, but rather impressive how he was able to figure this out.
Number 5. Feet binding. Beauty is pain. Am I right? I know. We humans spend a lot of time trying to be attractive for one another, and in ancient China, tiny feet, they were awesome. The tinier the feet, the more attractive they were. With bound feet, a woman's beauty was enhanced. Some were even bound to be 10 centimeters in size. So small. It was also a status symbol because the rich didn't need to work, because as you can guess, having deformed feet prevented women from being able to leave the house. So if you were poor, you didn't bind your feet. It was a painful process. They would soak the feet in warm water mixed with herbs and animal blood. Then they would curl the toes over the sole of the foot and wrap it in cloth, breaking the toes and the arches so that it could be as small as possible. Oof. It wasn't until 1912 that it was actually banned.
Number 4. The number 4. Literally. Some numbers are quite lucky when it comes to Chinese culture. The number 8, for example, if you had an apartment on the 8th floor, it would sell for a higher price than that of the 7th. And no, it's not because 7, 8, 9, but rather because the number 8 is pronounced ba, which sounds familiar to fa, as in fakai, which translates to becoming rich or well off. The 2008 Beijing Olympics kicked off on August 8th at 8:08 p.m., 8 seconds in. It's a big deal still to this day, but the number 4, on the other hand, over here is even more unlucky than the number 13. It's bad juju, the number 4. It actually causes traffic to this day in Beijing. Let me explain. The number 4 sounds a lot like the word death, so buildings don't have this number as a floor even. It goes 2, 3, 5. Although if you're on floor 5, you know what's up. The traffic problem though, that's when it gets intense. See, Beijing has a vehicle plate program set in order to maintain the flow of traffic and also to help out with pollution. Depending on which numbers end in your plate, so on weekdays, private cars with plates ending in 2 digits, 0 to 9, are not allowed to drive in Beijing's 5th Ring Road all day. So if your number is on a certain day, you need to find another route to work. Makes sense. So the lucky numbers are used more often, which means more traffic on those days, but if you had a plate ending in 4, that's just 2% of all cars. You're flying to work. You're laughing on the way to work. It's easy. You're there in 2 minutes.
Number 3. Terracotta warriors. Qin Shi Huang, who lived around 259 to 210 BCE, was not only an infamous conqueror in life, but he desired to be the same in death. He wanted to be immortalized, so he decided to build himself an immaculate tomb. It was basically an underground city guarded by the famous life-size terracotta warriors. But not only that, it was complete with gardens, stables, horses, bronze ritual vessels, jewelry, and heaps of treasure. This immaculate piece of art represented many of the ways in which the first emperor left an impression on his civilization. During his reign, he introduced standardized currency, writing, mathematical measurements, and plenty more. He was a military genius, though his methods were basically massacres. He was credited for unifying states together, but his underground city of immortality remains one of his most mysterious footprints he left, making sure the world never forgot him even thousands of years later.
Number 2. You're in trouble. We've done lists now on numerous ancient cultures and the way that they use their natural gift of water, varies. Romans would use their urine to wash their clothes, ancient Egyptians would pee on barley to predict a newborn sex. In ancient China, over 150 gallons of urine was often collected in this giant pan and then it was boiled until it evaporated. The result was something called autumn mineral, this crystallized urine residue that's later given to patients to consume. Yummy. Urine eggs were also a thing. That's when you boil an egg for an entire day in the not so mellow yellow. When it came down to smelling good in ancient China, the wealthy would wear scented bags, but if you weren't well off, you had to wash up with urine, just as the Romans did.
And last but not least, the lake of wine. A lake of wine? Sign me up! I'm in. I'm diving in. I prefer the grape variety, just like King Joe. It's tough to be a king, but he was resolved to make sure he had a damn good time. He must have loved the OG charcuterie boards because this dude ordered the construction of a pool of wine and a forest of meat. What? A pool of wine I can imagine. A forest of meat? No idea. The pool was massive, big enough to fit several canoes. In the middle of the pool was a little island with a tree made out of skewers of meat. Creative. Zhao and his concubines would pass the time floating around the pool of wine, plucking off meat and living their best life. Sounds awesome. Honestly, I'd be in. However, his decadence didn't really please his people. Kind of like a Marie Antoinette deal, and they began uprising, and as soon as he realized this was happening, instead of addressing it, he set himself on fire. So I think his time can be summarized by Trooper, we're here for a good time, not for a long time.
Number 10 is the Pet Patrol. Do you guys remember the scene in Disney's Aladdin where he steals a piece of fruit and miraculously evades capture? Well, in real ancient Egypt, our prince wouldn't have stood a chance as police in Egypt used baboons to catch thieves. Incredibly intelligent, these animals were able to be trained, which paired with their speed and ability to jump to places that are difficult for humans to reach, made them the perfect crime fighters. Baboons could also easily remember the face of any thief as they are ranked 3rd in the animal world for their memory. So don't go relying on any luck to get away with anything. Outside of their police duties, they were treated incredibly kindly, but trained to participate in picking fruit, making beer, and even dancing. Baboons were so beloved by Egyptians that some mummies were later found to have tattoos of baboons on their bodies. In ancient Egyptian mythology, baboons are best known for their association with Thoth, the god of wisdom. However, they were linked to many other gods as well. Definitely nothing like Babu in Aladdin. But wait, did I say tattoo? Well, being inked up is no modern phenomena. Number 9 is tatted up tuts. Egyptians joined indigenous, Nordic, African, and many other cultures of having a history of tattooing. Now, Egyptian tattooing was bizarre just because it was exclusive to only women. By tattooing in public regions of the body, the tattoos were intended to permanently mark the woman's association with religious worship, or on the flip side, they could also be used to symbolize the lower class and the mark of a dancing girl or a prostitute. That's what also makes it so bizarre. We can't really figure out why it was only women, what they meant, or what they symbolized beyond the vague generalization I just gave you. Tattooed mummies dating back to the 11th century dynasty have been found by archaeologists, some with religious symbolism, other with dots and swirls located on the lower chest, the abdominal, and the thighs. Some mummies were believed to have been tattooed with medical symbols, potentially to treat ailments. Although the meaning of ancient Egyptian tattoos may be unclear, it seems evident that they had an array of implications and that women of many different social classes chose to wear them. Baddies. Speaking of things we can't understand.
Number 8. Hooks. Growing up watching cartoons, I've seen many versions of Captain Hook, or pirates that resemble a Captain Hook type villain. They all have the eye patch, earrings, and to make them more menacing, they have hooks for hands. Dustin Hoffman scared the shit out of me growing up in the movie Hook. It's literally called Hook. What's up with this? Well, this wasn't a move by film studios, this was actually historically accurate. Back in those days, they didn't have advanced prosthetic limbs, and when you're sword fighting over loot, well, odds are you're gonna lose a hand or two at one point. These pirates actually got compensation, which is so funny to me, just imagining a pirate filling out an insurance form, that's funny, but their replacement tool was usually a hook or a peg leg. They would just replace your leg with a singular piece of wood. That was the best they could do back then, and it had to work. Another fun little fact, if you got injured, your payroll came out of everybody's collective treasure. So you better have that athletic stance down and dodge some swords or else you're getting some shame. A lot of shame coming your way.
At number 7, walk the plank. I'm sure you have no doubt heard of the term walking the plank, right? It is the stereotypical pirate thing to do when you need to get rid of someone. If You know what I mean. Well, we've sort of been misled by this whole walking the plank thing, because rather than it be a method of offing your buddy Joe for not following orders, it was actually used as a method of psychological torture. Now don't get me wrong, pirates had many other imaginative and gruesome ways of unaliving people, but walking the plank really wasn't one of them. It was actually a relatively rare practice, as pirates like to do their unaliving practices pretty swiftly. Rather than making their unlucky victim walk a plank into the ocean, the most common form of putting someone 6 feet under, so to speak, was through keel hauling. Keel hauling was where you tied someone to a rope, threw them into the water, and pulled them under the boat and up to the other side. Now you would think that this person could just hold their breath and then survive, but no, not really. Instead, the unlucky soul would be hitting up against the boat and getting shredded by the barnacles on the boat before coming up to the surface. I don't know about you, but after knowing that, I would much rather walk the plank.
Number 6. Maps, books, and gold. Just as valuable as gold and silver, back in the day, maps were a treasure in itself. It kind of helps knowing where you're going, to be fair. Also, pirates need to remember where they left their treasure. You can't really rely on a drunken pirate's memory now, can you? These charts would be stolen, obviously, and in turn, these guys would go on a little National Treasure Hans Zimmer pirate adventure. One map in particular from the 1680s, the Spanish Atlas, was stolen, and National Geographic called this stolen map extremely valuable pirate booty. So this treasure's still out there somewhere, and somebody's got the directions. Knowledge was key. They didn't have Siri hanging out all day to answer navigational questions. They even had to steal books. Pirates stealing books. What a scene. Some of these pirate heists wouldn't even involve treasure. They would sword fight and just hope that the books on board were worth the battle. Imagine losing countless crew members and all you got is the captain's daily logs. Just sailing the high seas, roasting William Kidd's girl problems. You're like, what an idiot!
At number 5, marooning. Let's talk about the brutal yet mysterious practice of marooning, and no, we're not talking about Maroon 5. Marooning was a pirate punishment, probably the most dreaded punishment of them all, where someone who committed a serious offense would be taken to a deserted island and then left there. No food, no water, just you and the island. For many, this was a slow and painful death. Being left on an island in the hot sun meant you got badly sunburnt, you had no food unless you could find something in the area, and chances were that there was no fresh water on that island, so you would become dehydrated quite quickly. At high tide, the water could flood the island, or you would be left standing in water up to your neck, and any predators in the area would have seen you as a little snack. This sounds like a terrible way to go. I could not imagine the physical and psychological torment that would come with such a fate. Man, I'm glad I'm not a pirate.
Number 4. Pirate curfew. This next one made me laugh out loud while I was reading up on it. It doesn't matter how badass or cool you think you are, even if you're a literal pirate, you still have a bedtime. These guys would straight up abandon their mateys, they would leave them on an island to die, and then sword fight over treasure. But come 8 o'clock, it's time to shut her down. Because it's pirate code, you can't break the code. Captain Blackbart Bartholomew Roberts, he insisted back in 1722 that lights and candles were out at 8 o'clock sharp. If anybody wanted to stay up later than 8, they can go and hang out on the deck. Honestly, I love this rule. I'm here for this. Imagine roommates being on board for this as well. Nowadays, you get the best sleep of your life. Thing is, these guys needed all the time they could get because they had to sleep in hammocks. Not the most comfortable or relaxing environment. A hammock nap, sure, but a hammock sleep every night? No wonder pirates were so angry. It's starting to make sense.
At number 3, cryptic treasure. There once lived a pirate named Olivier Levasseur, and he was considered one of the last great pirates. Over the years, it was said that Levasseur had stolen many treasures of great value and had a large haul of precious finds. Once people finally caught up to him, he was captured and sentenced to death by hanging, but before he died, his final words were, quote, "Find my treasure, the one who may understand it," end quote. And then he threw a cryptogram into the crowd, and that was the last of them. To this day, no one has been able to decipher the code. Some believe that perhaps this cryptic message was simply designed to lead people on a wild goose chase as a final joke. However, in the 20th century, a man named Reginald Herbert Cruz Wilkins, say that 5 times fast, made a breakthrough. He had been searching for the treasure for years and finally found the cave that he believed the treasure was located. Unfortunately, the cave's conditions made it impossible to get through, so the treasure remains a mystery to this day. Can you believe this all started because a pirate wanted to pull a Da Vinci Code on us? Unbelievable.
Number 2. Julius Caesar. Pirates would often take people and demand treasure. They would use hostage situations as a main ploy. In fact, at one point in history, pirates managed to scoop up Julius Caesar. Like the Julius Caesar. The Emperor of Rome went through his fair share of trials, and at just age 25, he was held captive for 38 days with pirates. That's a very long time to hear horrible sea chanties. When pirates demanded ransom for the release of the young man, they set his price for 20 talents, but according to historians, that price was deemed too low from Caesar himself. He actually laughed at it and reminded these pirates that they had no idea who it was they captured. He said to ask for 50 instead of 20. How insane is that?
And finally, at number 1, pirate tunnels. You know the secret tunnel from Avatar: The Last Airbender? Well, this secret pirate tunnel is kind of similar. Below the city of Savannah, Georgia lies a series of underground tunnels that are believed to have been used by pirates. The pirates would use these tunnel systems to smuggle goods in and out of the area, as well as to smuggle captured sailors. It is said that these tunnels would lead directly to the location where the ships would have been waiting in the harbor. Apparently, there is a tunnel that led from a building in town known as the Pirate's House all the way to the river where small rowing boats would have been waiting. It has also been theorized that the Sons of Liberty, a group of people who strongly opposed the British government, would also use these pirate tunnels to meet up and have a little shindig. There are so many mysteries that surround these pirate tunnels, and many of them remain unsolved.
Number 10. The bird. To flip somebody the bird, or to flip somebody off in general, of course this means to give them the middle finger. But do we even know why we do this? It's automatic, right? You lose in Mario Kart, you throw it up. Why? Why do we do it? I don't recommend it, first of all, because obviously you're gonna get in a heap of trouble afterwards, whoever's on the receiving end of that bird. Said bird is gonna sail, and it's gonna be upset, whoever gets it. But giving somebody the middle finger comes from 4th century BC Athens. Yes, thank you so much. I love this invention, if you wanna call it that. The philosopher Diogenes expressed how he felt to visitors about Demosthenes. Now, he described his distaste by putting up a middle finger. Now, the idea here was that it was a phallic gesture. Yeah, the middle finger is supposed to be, you know, your and the surrounding curled fingers are meant to represent the you-know-whos, right? We're talking about, yeah, I can't say what I want to say, but we're starting this list off on a great note, aren't we? Number 9, Thermopylae. Our next stop is the coastal passage of Thermopylae in Greece, also known as the Hot Gates back in 480 BC. Now, this was a beautiful stage for a battle that became a symbol of courage against overwhelming odds, and also became a Zack Snyder movie, which is pretty cool, I guess. Under the rule of King Xerxes, the Persian Empire sought to conquer Greece. Outnumbered, a small alliance of Greek city-states led by King Leonidas of Sparta, they resisted. They said, nope, not on my watch. So about 7,000 Greeks faced an estimate 100,000 to 150,000 Persians. Now, the Greeks used the narrow terrain to their advantage, right? They knew this. They funneled the Persian forces and then they held them there for 3 days straight. But on the 3rd day, something happened. On the 3rd day, a local resident betrayed the Greeks, how dare thee, showing the Persians a mountain path that led behind Greek lines. Now, Leonidas was aware of his doomed fate. He dismissed the bulk of his army and remained with, you guessed it, 300 Spartans and a few hundred others to fight to the death. Now, although the Persians ultimately won, the Greeks' heroic stand at Thermopylae allowed the city-states time to prepare for the Persian onslaught that followed. It has since been an enduring symbol of bravery and sacrifice in the face of overwhelming odds. And again, Zack Snyder saw this. He's like, cha-ching, let's do it. A lot of abs. Paint those abs on. Number 8, what's the buzz? Here we go. Shout out to all the bees. Cleopatra was the last Greek ruler of Egypt, and she had some bold ideas, you could say. So we're not exactly sure of its purpose, but we have some ideas. But there's a large amount of experts that have all agreed that Cleopatra, Greek-Egyptian ruler of Egypt, she was known to sometimes fill a small box with a bunch of bees and then shake that box around to disturb said bees, and voila, now we have a very weak massager. There's been some speculation as to why she created this bee box, and sure, you can use your imagination to some degree. Probably, yes. This invention, this scandalous idea, we're pretty sure it was inspired during her time ruling in Egypt, because, you know, all the bees. Also, to put a box of bees anywhere near your box of bees, you know what I mean? Bravo, that's brave. If she did what all these scholars think that she did with this vibrating box of bees, then double bravo. That's brave. I don't even go near one bee flying around, let alone a box of them. No, thank you. Number 7, shaved eyebrows. close one. I thought they were gone there for a second. Look, I love animals, okay? We all grew up with cats, dogs in our family, birds. We had a chameleon at one point. That was interesting. But nobody mourned for their furry loved ones like ancient Egyptians. When the family cat died back then, not one, but every family member involved in the household, they would all shave off their eyebrows to mourn the cat's death. Cats were loved extra hard back then. Yeah, you think cats are spoiled today? When's the last time you saw your friend with their shaved eyebrows after their cat passed away? Yeah, didn't think so. God forbid, but if that fateful day shall arrive, commit. You know what I mean? Shave them off. Show them your love and shave them off. Number 6, stitches. While surgery did exist during ancient Egyptian times, common surgeries, invasive surgery wasn't quite as common because, well, 1, no painkillers and antibiotics, and 2, it's gonna hurt, and the list goes on and on. It's horrible. But one thing that's less invasive but still quite extremely important back then that was seen quite a bit during these times was the use of stitches. Yeah, probably need some at some point. Building pyramids made of stones and rocks, you're gonna cut yourself. Ancient Egyptians found different and effective ways to make their own stitches in order to close these large wounds. They did so by using plant fibers, hair, so gross, tendons, even more gross, and even wool threads. Evidence in different mummified remains have been discovered. Yeah, imagine that. You cut your arm, you have to use someone else's tendon to stitch it up. No thanks, just leave it open. I'm all set. In the oldest known surgical text, which is referred to now as the Edwin Smith Papyrus, that came to ancient Egypt, there are 48 different cases of stitches being described, and they all sound like a great time. One example from the text of treating a laceration reads, quote, "If thou findest that wound open and its stitching loose, thou shalt draw together for him the gash with 2 strips of linen." Basically says, hey, if you cut yourself, grab a shirt. Good luck. Don't move too quick. Number 5, breaks. Yeah, I've never broken anything and I don't plan to. Sounds like the worst thing. I see it on Reddit and I'm like, ooh. But living in ancient Egypt, you're gonna break a bone or dislocate something sometime. But back then, it's not like you can just head over to the emergency and get an x-ray or a cast and then get your buddies, a couple of pharaohs to sign it and get some crutches and be on your way. No. So how did they treat broken bones or dislocations back then? Well, we can look at one example from that Edwin Smith Papyrus that I mentioned earlier, where there was a patient with 2 dislocated clavicles. Now the treatment here is described as follows. If thou examinest a man having a dislocation in his 2 collarbones, thou shalt find his 2 shoulders turned over and the heads of his 2 collarbones turned towards his face. Imagine reading this and you're like, okay, I think we turn this way? No, this way, hang on. Thou shouldn't cause them to fall back so that they rest in their places. Thou shalt bind it with stiff rolls of linen and thou shalt treat it afterwards with grease and honey every day. Yeah, if you break something, don't put grease and honey on. Go to the doctors. Hit that thumbs up. There we go. The more we know. Number 4, dental surgery. Okay, so back in the ancient Egyptian world, it's not like you can go to the dentist, get your teeth checked and cleaned, whatever, once a year, however you do it, I don't know. And the diet of the ancient Egyptian was most definitely not exactly, the cleanest, if I can say that. You wouldn't have a set of pearly whites every single day, that's for sure. And that's due to the fact that the tools used to grind food would often leave traces of sand and or stone behind, which, well, in your mouth is not going to feel too good. That would cause tooth loss or troubles at an early age. Through documents found, there have been a few different dental treatments from that time, and they're a little interesting, like topical treatments and such. But one case was able to give us a glimpse into what is believed to be the treatment of an abscess. And yeah, buckle up. Even more interesting is a mummy that was found from the 4th dynasty. Now this mummy, in his first molar, a bunch of surgically produced holes were there that they believe were used to drain an abscess, which clearly gives us some very tangible evidence that dental surgeries were performed back then in some way, shape, or form. I mean, in the form of a bunch of holes, and it's disgusting, but they tried. And do remember, as you're watching this entire video, all this was done without any anesthetic. So drilling holes, breaking bones, putting linen into your arms, you're gonna feel all of it. Number 3, Anubis. Anubis, the ancient Egyptian god of mummification. Yeah, he had an interesting hobby, this one. Anubis, historically, he oversaw the embalming process during mummification. A lot of steps involved in mummification, so the backup here, the backseat driving, that is Anubis, I'm sure was appreciated. Ancient Egyptians were so sophisticated in the mummification process that they also had to get really good at another major, well, kind of creepy surgery, and that is the post-mortem dissection. That matters, that's a pretty important step. See, in order to mummify the body, they needed to remove any moisture from it. Now this process included the removal of brain tissue, which was done through quite a gruesome hook tool and some steady hands, that's for sure. This was not a medical practice, however, it was more of a spiritual one, right? It wasn't done by doctors, and this is exactly why they were getting extra up close and personal with internal organs during this process. The medical information they gathered during this process was never used for medical or medical advancement, but rather for spiritual, like Anubis, this ancient wonder. He kept trophies from those that he embalmed. embalmed. Like, you know, different parts from people, that kind of thing. Word spreads, you know, hey, Anubis likes body parts, pass it on, this guy's weird. So in turn, for centuries now, Egyptians would then offer pieces of lifeless bodies to Anubis. They're like, you know what, hey, heard you like toes, big guy. Here you go, enjoy, put that in your jar. You love it. Whoever gave him the jackal head, great call, that was a great call. He loves that one, big fan. Number 2, dirty trick. The god Osiris ruled over ancient Egypt, but it wasn't an easy path, okay? Just like ancient Rome, there's always a jealous brother or jealous someone watching from the bushes, okay? Osiris's brother, Set, he was a jealous one. So he tried to take out Osiris at every single turn. Now, one elaborate plot was so crazy that it actually worked. This was like a saw trap setup. This is insane. So first, Set designed a coffin that fit Osiris's measurements, like to a T. So at a party, casually one day, Set challenged Osiris to hop into said coffin, saying, challenging that if he can fit inside of it, the coffin is his. Yeah, like a gift. So for some reason, Osiris accepted the challenge, he jumped in, and as soon as Osiris got into the coffin, bam, Set locked him inside and threw the coffin in the Nile River. So in turn, Set then took over control of Egypt. Yeah, gotcha, got the last one there. So if any of your coworkers want to show you a coffin in the break room, respectfully decline the offer. It's probably a trap. And finally, number 1, scarab worship. Yeah, we're getting stinky for the last one. Ancient Egyptians, they worshipped scarabs. They worshipped dung beetles. Now, when we think about animals in relation to ancient Egyptians, we go to cats first. But really, it was dung beetles the whole time. They're OG, those little stinkers. Egyptians could not keep their hands or their minds off of dung beetles. The Egyptians would observe scarabs rolling these balls of dung, and they would roll them along the ground until suddenly each beetle would disappear just like that into a hole in the sand. Now, ancient Egyptians compared these patterns to that of the sun, which of course would go over and then leave at the end of the day. Just a ball rolling and then disappears. I can see the connections. Now, the god Khepri was depicted as a man with a massive scarab as a head, so he was responsible for rolling the sun across the sky every single day. And no, the sun wasn't a big ball of poop, it was just a big ball of life. Kicking off the list at number 10, the Zanzwingdui runes. These runes, located in China's southwest province, may just provide archaeologists clues on their past. Very recently, this past year as a matter of fact, new artifacts were found, a total of 534 relics. These cultural staples made of bronze, gold, ivory, a couple of these relics have been turning heads and raising eyebrows. This 3,000-year-old bronze figure, for example, seems to be holding an ancient wine vessel, and this relic stands a little over 1 meter. These runes were luckily discovered during a refurbishment of a primary school. The Sichuan Provincial Cultural Relics and Archaeology Research Institute found over 80 tombs, 60 ash pits, and 10 building zones, all of them dating back to the Western Zhou dynasty, so back around 770 BC. Researchers have been examining this site for a couple years now, and although the people of Shu left little to no detail on their culture, we're finding all these artifacts that tell us a story. Like for example, the 1-pound gold mask found in one of the 6 sacrificial pits. So we're getting there, one beautiful relic at a time.
Number 9, seahorses. Ancient Chinese medicine was kind of incredible. Honestly, they had like a kind of sixth sense when it came to how certain things might work. Some of them were pretty questionable, I will say, I will not lie, but they had something right about seahorses. Even today, you can find seahorses at markets as a street snack, but beyond a tasty treat, they have been used as a part of Chinese medicine since time immemorial. It was believed that they had the potential to cure infertility, baldness, asthma, and arthritis. Research work on seahorses provided information that has the ability to help ease inflammatory symptoms associated with arthritis. A peptide derived from the seahorse species Hippocampus cuda proved to be effective towards chondrocyte cells, so they were kind of right. It did do something.
Thank God though, because it all came at the price of celebrity status. And yeah, it's still a price if your social rank remains that of a gutter rat. Your reminder that gladiators, no matter how esteemed, were lumped into the social ladder with working girls and heretics. Though often dismissed as uncivilized brutes by Roman historians and aristocracy, traditionally the gladiators won massive fame amongst the lower classes. So much that a name was coined for their ancient fangirl gaggles, ludiae, or training school girls, coined by Juvenal once again. Gladiator portraits graced the walls of many public places. Children played with gladiator action figures made of clay, and the most successful of fighters even endorsed products like today's app. Many women wore jewelry glazed in their blood and mixed some of their sweat into some of their cosmetics. I'll dare any one of you guys watching to walk onto an NBA court and try and get some LeBron sweat for your next face mask. We know that gladiators were private citizens with a life sentence, people overwhelmed by debt, criminals, and occasionally free men attracted to the arena by promises of riches and honors. They never lost their community connections though, and becoming a gladiator, and those who managed to make a killing at it, pun intended, have been documented to heavily give back to communities they came from, free enslaved individuals, and support the economy. One of the ways they could do that was brotherhoods, because anyone who wasn't nobility had a pretty good sense as to what the Roman day-to-day was like, so they knew if everyone was already against them, their class, and had no intention to raise them above said stereotype, then howdy doody, they'll just support their own lives and economies while the royal ladies fetishize them and the royal kids admire them. Yes, regularly they would be throwing down in life or death combat against one another, but gladiators viewed themselves as a kind of brotherhood, and often took it upon themselves to organize into collegia, with their own elected leaders and chosen protector deity from the wide pantheon of available gods. When a warrior fell in battle, these groups would ensure that their comrade received a proper funeral and grave inscription honoring his achievements in the arena. The same can be said for grievous injuries. Pooled union money could go towards a surgery or recovery or medicine of dire need. If the deceased had a wife or children, they would also see the family receive monetary compensation for their loss. This tradition protected their own, their community, and the fallen. And as you could guess, injuries and fatalities are pretty common in a battle of contrast. Gladiator battles had a lot of overlooked details and facets that don't bleed over into common conversation. You can have a whole conversation about what gladiators would wear while duking it out with his enemies without understanding why. It goes back to one word: tradition. Shocking, seeing as it's literally in the name of the video. The Romans liked a battle of contrast, matching a heavily armed and armored man against a lightly equipped and more barren opponent. It's supposed to be like some Tom and Jerry, one big broody type throwing everything he can, including the monkey wrench, at the lighter, smaller man who runs in circles around him. I am essentially telling you that the Romans set up their death games similar to how we set up cartoons. Yeah, I am. Big plot device came from all this blood sport lunacy. Chunky, slow moving. You sure you don't want some veggies there, Barley Boy? I'm just kidding. Also, gladiators are dead now, so I can't hurt their feelings. Besides, Barley Boy was a real title for the cranky tough guys. Researchers who studied 2,000-year-old skeletal remains of 67 gladiators were able to test them for certain elements, including calcium and zinc. Using scientific method of isotopic analysis, they reconstructed the diets of the gladiators and discovered that they ate a plant-based, carb-rich diet that included barley and beans, very little animal protein. They also drank calcium supplements made from charred plants. Unlike the modern-day vegan who follows this kind of diet out of ethical motivations or being raised by the nothing tastes better than thin generation mom, gladiators evidently did it for pragmatic reasons. The diet was so curated and consistent that even with different dishes and spices, their diet was consistent enough to be called, you guess it, tradish. Love the puns. Gladiators fell into eating a lot of simple carbs to boost subcutaneous fat, which helped increase their survival chances in battle. Because of this fatty cushion, their blood vessels and nerves were better protected in fights. Whether or not they knew all the big sciencey words to explain it, I couldn't tell you, but they clearly picked up on it. That's what made this become such an indoctrinated diet for the gladiator. It was consistently proven to work, be efficient, and produce results. Besides, meat was for the rich anyway. Thankfully, gladiator medicine evolved after Greece fell to Rome, meaning it was time for some Greek training. The Roman gladiatorial games were a far cry from the Olympic and theatrical pursuits enjoyed in ancient Greece, but the Greeks played an important role in preparing gladiators for their violent contests. After their incorporation into the Roman Empire, the ancient Greeks quickly carved out a little niche for themselves in a multitude of professions. Greek philosophers were employed to educate the sons of wealthy Roman aristocrats, merchants took advantage of the Pax Romana to sell their goods far and wide, and the chefs and bakers got to really blow some sandals off. For Greek athletes and physicians, Roman rule offered other opportunities. Gladiators, who required training and medical care, and the Greeks had the requisite skills to provide them. Their role might have been similar to that of a strength and conditioning coach employed to help modern athletes today. By this time, the ancient Greeks had spent centuries refining their strength and conditioning practices for the Olympics and other games, so the Greek trainers were perfect for this role. They understood kinesiology, diet, regime, all the things that gladiators had been lacking before them. The most comprehensive primary source on gladiator medical care comes from Galen, a Greek physician, surgeon, and philosopher who in 167 AD returned to his native city of Pergamon to work as a physician to the gladiators of the High Priest of Asia. According to the historian of medicine, Vivian Nutton, only 2 gladiators died when Galen was operating in Pergamon, whereas 60 had been killed in the tenure of his predecessor. Galen's experience treating wounds and sometimes dying gladiators provided opportunities for medical discoveries. He disproved Aristotle's assertion that the heart was the seat of the reason by observing a dying gladiator who sustained mortal wounds to the heart remained lucid until death. And while having a robust body may save your life, a pretty face sells the case. There were several types of gladiators, the distinctions based on the type of weaponry and tactics, but the most beautiful gladiators were held in high esteem. When the opponents for a gladiator were chosen, their beauty beauty was taken into account. Ugliness ruined the lustrous fascination with viciousness, while beauty simultaneously emphasized the pain of mortality. Real artsy-fartsy, these Romans. The retiarius, a gladiator fighting with equipment resembling that of a fisherman, was the least armed combatant in the arena, armed with a trident, a dagger, a net. A retiarius wore nothing but a loincloth, a belt, and a minimal amount of armor. He was considered inferior to other gladiators, literally dubbed unnecessary to kill, and there was an aspect of homosexuality and effeminacy to his appearance and role in battle. He was to represent the ardent love of soft masculine beauty in Roman Greece, placed in the plight of human disgust and sin. Thus, Retiarius would stand out in battle but not be crucial to it. Since Retiarius is not really high on the list of gladiator discussion piles, I'll leave you with satire 2 and 8, wherein writer Juvenal described Gratius, a man who disgraced himself by becoming the male bridegroom to a horn player. Not the disgrace here, but Juvenal was a massive hater and everyone knows it. A lot of sexist tirades. However, that marriage, like said, was not the embarrassing moment. It was when he fought by choice and effed up his one job as Retiarius, which was to throw the net at the guy. He missed the throw like an effing idiot and was forced to run for his life. Even Gratius' opponent was ashamed to be fighting him. Here's a crazy one, name based off defeat. Hey, to cut all the preamble and get right to it, they literally named all their categories of gladiator types after places they conquered. That's it, that's the show, pack it up, and good night everyone. These gladiators would then fight with some Romanized versions of their traditional weapons and fighting styles, and were sometimes also given a gladiatorial category due to being ethnic themselves, as it was a great way to show off how un-Roman you were when chosen to be an opponent. In creating gladiators of this type to fight for them, the Romans tried to mark out those in the ring as different than them and more deserving of the humiliation of fighting for others' entertainment. So let's learn about a few categories. The people of Gaul, which had roughly covered modern France and Belgium, proved to be a formidable foe to Rome, as demonstrated when they plundered the city in 390 BCE. They were feared by the Romans until conquered by Julius Caesar, and then Gaul became deeply integrated into the empire and as being a wealthy province and provided many members to the Roman elite. So the gladiator was actually renamed the murmillo to reflect the changing attitude later on. Another type of gladiator was called the hoplomaches, and he was modeled off the hoplite, the quintessential soldier of the Greek antiquity. They were equipped with a sword, a spear, and a round shield. The Romans encountered the Thracians, who lived in the southeast Balkans between Bulgaria, Greece, and Turkey, and to the Romans they were wild and savage, so they modeled that gladiator, the Thrax, as such, with a small rectangular shield, 2 leg greaves, a curved simcar, and a bunch of other weapons. Emperor Caligula was fond of appearing as a Thracian fighter. In his case, it's hard to know if he picked that type as an ethnic connotation or because they were just super cool and scary. And last but never least, who is surprised to hear that traditionally women got the short stick? Literally, they were given short sticks sometimes. Why? Even though we have a very limited history of female gladiators, it can tell us that they were hardcore B-word brawls that put men to shame at first, and transitioned into a spectacle more on par with 2 sorority girls jello wrestling in bikinis. Female gladiators are gladiatrix in modern language, while ancient texts referred to them as Ludia or Molières, weren't as common as their male counterparts, but they did make their way into the ring. They were highly sexualized. Female gladiators only wore loincloths as opposed to the tunics men wore, and they were not given helmets, presumably to show off their faces and hairstyles. Fights featuring female gladiators represented the pinnacle of luxury and indulgence, often present at private parties held by the Roman elite. Unlike their male counterparts, who were often forced into the gladiator life, it's believed gladiatrix chose to fight for financial gain, honor, spite, or fame. Although evidence to support the historical existence isn't vast, it's compelling. Written and archaeological records have survived, including a marble relief and funerary items. One statue, believed to depict a female gladiator, features a bare-chested woman holding a sica, associated with a type of gladiator known as the Thrax. Further substantiating the history of female gladiators is a law that barred free women from participating in the arena games if they were 20 years or younger. The creation of this law was seen as an inadvertent recognition of the fact that women had been participating already. Male gladiators, however, kept hacking away at each other for another 2 centuries before the last recorded gladiatorial contest occurred in 404 AD. The fight between these 2 women, the goddess Achilles and the queen of an Amazon warrior tribe, survives as an interesting example of a serious female contest. An ancient marble relief, now in the British Museum, naturally, shows that these 2 women fought well and respectively and were both granted their freedom at the end of it.
Number 10. The Sins of Our Fathers. Law and Order is not just a hit drama from the 90s with a killer soundtrack, but something that started with the civilizations a very long time ago. King Hammurabi and his code of law comes to mind. But today, we're talking about ancient Persia. We're talking about a corrupt judge named Sisimons. After taking a bribe and delivering a not so unbiased verdict, the king found out and was most displeased. This is one of the worst things to do to another human being, but poor Sisimons was flayed. Or in simpler terms, they done skinned that feller alive. To make an unholy situation even more uncomfortable, they made a chair and used his hide as a material, and made his son sit in the flesh chair to make his own judgments. Can't help but think that you'd be sitting there all day thinking of dear old dad because you're sitting on top of a chair that's kind of fuzzy, because dad had a lot of back hair. Yikes. Number 9. The annual purge. I don't know about you folks at home, but I love the holiday season. For me specifically, Christmas. And to me, the meaning of Christmas is something less to do with religious background, but just good cheer. Spending time with loved ones and friends, and really enjoying a nice homemade meal. I mean, come on, turkey with the stuffing. Can't go wrong there. And honestly, you can't beat a good stuffing. I love it! But looking back at ancient Persia, there was a different kind of holiday. One that also has its roots in less about religion and more about cold-blooded killings. There were Zoroastrian priests called the Magi, and although they weren't Persian, they were somewhat respected in Persian culture. But when a plot to overthrow the king was enacted, the Persians were not too happy, and slaughtered the people responsible for the coup. But just for good measure, they also slaughtered all the other priests in the palace. Okay, but they might have missed some outside in the city and they had to get them too. You know what, how about every year on this day we go on a Magi hunt? So it became a holiday. Every year on the day of the coup, there was a grand feast, and then a hunt for the remaining survivors. That's really comforting, that's nice. Number 8, my eyes! As previously mentioned, the ninja were stealthy warriors who did the dirty jobs no one else could. Specifically samurai, as the Bushido Code literally forbade them from it. And honestly, they were kind of high sniffing their own farts, as they felt a lot of things were below them, including ninjas. I for one would not want to disrespect such a worthy foe. What the ninja lack in a full military force or simply being in a traditional battle, they make up for it with their tactics and weapons. Equipped with a variety of weapons with a variety of uses, the most unholiest weapon in the ninja's arsenal was the Mitsubishi egg, not to be confused with Mitsubishi. A small container of sorts that held dirt and dust that when used would blind and disorientate the enemy. The worst flavor of this egg being filled with crushed glass. Yeah, crushed glass in the eye. It caused excruciating pain and would be quite difficult to deal with medically at the time. Honestly, who throws glass in eyes? Number 7. You can't come in. Tokugawa Iemitsu was the big bad shogun in power. And when you're the big bad shogun in power, you get to make big bad decisions. He ushered in the beginning of the Edo period, one that would see Japan prosper for a while, but it did eventually decline. Perhaps the worst part of this time was Japan's isolation. Japan basically locked itself in its bedroom and with a roar of prepubescent rage told the world not to come into my room. Tokugawa forbade any Japanese ships from leaving and anyone from entering. The penalty for disobeying such rule was death. Japan was nervous at the time as many European nations were beginning to colonize, and if they could rip apart a dynasty like China, surely they would be next. This isolation period lasted over 200 years, and while the world moved on, Japan kinda stayed frozen in time. Of course, like most laws, they get broken, and on the southern tips of Japan's coast, there was some important trading with the Dutch, but we won't tell anybody. Number 6. Manifest Destiny. Looking back on history, the United States and Japan are probably most recognized together as being combatants of that one war with that weird mustache guy, whatever it was called. And that war ending in the worst party favor ever, honestly. But that wasn't the first time these two nations met. It was a beautiful summer day in 1853 when just off the shores of Tokyo Bay some strange ships came into view. They were American ships with cannons, and they came bearing gifts to the emperor. And a very real ultimatum that can be summed up as, my friends, you have been closed for too long. Open for trade, or else be annihilated, then open for trade. After some time, the Japanese really didn't have a choice. They dissolved the 200-year order to be isolated. The Americans were looking for trade, but in truth, a large motivation for their forced opening of Japan was manifest destiny. God bless America. God bless them. Number 5. When in Rome. Having a large quantity of warships in your harbor with shiny new weapons and technology is bad for one's health. But worse than that, it puts you in a position to be colonized. And to be fair, there was a good chance of that happening. From multiple nations actually. So when given an ultimatum, it was time to make a decision. But perhaps this wasn't all bad. The Japanese actually came up with a rather good solution. What if we take all the new technology and run with it? Maybe it's time to colonize some places ourselves, thought a room full of people ready to overthrow the feudal government with modern technology. And that's exactly what they did. An event in Japanese history called the Meiji Restoration was just that. What's unholy about the whole thing is how fast they did it, restoring the imperial reign but at the same time making it a very modern one. Within a few years, it had become the most powerful superpower in Asia. When in Rome, do as the Romans do. Number 4. The Last Samurai. Japan went from feudal kingdoms to an imperial powerhouse maybe too quickly. Samurai for the longest time were a part of Japanese nobility. Swords for hire that became so rich and powerful that they essentially became the government themselves. So when the Meiji Restoration came about, the use of knights for hire really wasn't necessary with an imperial army and government. Tensions rose as a samurai rebellion had broken out. The samurai of the old world with traditional weapons, some firearms, and the new and powerful imperial Japanese army with modern weapons and lots of soldiers. After Imperial Japanese victory, Japan would shortly begin its expansion and colonization of Asia, taking the stage as a major world player. Number 3. Stomach pains. If you know anything about Japanese history, you knew this was coming. No, not the Logan Paul incident, but seppuku, the tradition of unaliving yourself with the most pain possible. Look, you gotta give samurai credit. They follow that Bushido code to the T. I mean, I can't even commit to a good book sometimes. But as crazy as the tradition sounds to us, to the samurai, honor means everything. Often done when defeated or disgraced, it's a ritual knife to the belly, and see you soon in the afterlife, oh mighty emperor. The most well-known case of this was the tale of the 47 Ronin, who after being disgraced and avenging their master, were granted seppuku by the shogun. The story has been told in many plays and even some films. Number 2. Tis but a scratch, sir. Katanas are beautiful pieces of art in warfare. Just ask anyone at an anime convention, they'll tell you. But in all seriousness, a lot of time and effort goes into constructing a samurai blade. One might even say the blacksmith's soul gets put into every strike of his hammer. So when the blade is completed, you gotta test drive it. Make sure it's sharp. To test the sharpness of a samurai edge, you would use bamboo, animals, and the occasional criminal. This practice was called tameshigiri. That's right. They would test it on people. But I mean, what better way to know what your sword is gonna do than by knowing what it's going to do? Katanas could easily remove limbs from torsos. Records of these events have provided some knowledge of the human body's resistance to edge weapons. Thanks, samurai. And number 1, artsy brothels. Geisha women wore beautiful kimono robes and were oftentimes mistaken for being courtesans. While in some cases that is true about geishas, they were more like me. Wait, what? All jokes aside, they were more humble hosts for these pleasure quarters, oftentimes entertaining men before the scandalous behavior occurred. This was a time of great cultural and artistic expansion in Japan. So these pleasure houses were legal. A lot of these women, while not having the same amount of freedom and choice as today, actually did have more than their European counterparts. Nice.
At number 10, creation. Every religion and civilization from the dawn of humanity has come up with their own unique stories as to how the world was created. Some civilizations have credited aliens, others have credited a benevolent god, and many of these gods have their own unique ways of creating life. Though we've heard stories of gods creating people out of things like corn or mud or just thin air, I don't think these stories could even compare to the ancient Egyptian story of creation. These ancient people believed that their very first god, Atum, created himself. As such, he had no wife and literally no one else to potentially procreate with, and so to create his and thus create humanity, he busted it. Literally. He just gave himself a 1-2 meat massage and boom. Out of that process, he created his kids Shu and Tefnut. A very fitting name if you ask me. This legend, I guess you could say, created the term the god's hand, and this was used to refer to women back in ancient Egypt since Atum's hand played the quote-unquote female role in the creation of his offspring. This term was also carried over into other civilizations like in the Greco-Roman period, so if you ever hear someone say god's hand, now you know where that came from. At number 9, cheating death. These days, if you get caught cheating on your partner, the worst that could happen to you is you break up, or you get a divorce, or maybe even get exposed on social media. But back in the times of ancient Egypt, the punishment for adultery was much worse than having your relationship end. Instead, your life would be the thing that ends. Obviously, in any civilization, any kind of relationship can always happen outside of a marriage. The only varying difference is the punishment for it. For the ancient Egyptians, being caught having an adulterous relationship was punishable by death. pretty harsh for having a sneaky link, but I guess they took their relationships much more seriously back then. One of the most famous cases of a serial adulterer, if you will, came from a man named Heneb, who was known to sleep with many married women and even had his own son join in on his escapades too. As you can imagine, things didn't really end well for them, so if you ever go back in time to ancient Egypt, just be careful of who you sleep with. Before we continue talking about some of the things that your teachers might not have taught you about ancient Egypt, why not leave a like on this video if you're enjoying it so far, and while you're at it, consider subscribing to the channel to see more videos like this one.
Number 8. Poaching. It's 2021. We all know it's super uncool to poach. Illegally hunting endangered species for fun, or just one sought after piece of the animal like elephant tusks for ivory. Our Persian friends from the past just might have been partaking in the poaching of rhinos. While in the ancient world the laws of today were not around to protect animals, the reason was still there, and people wanted horns. For some reason, however, people thought that rhino horn held the power to purify water. Thus, it was used to detect poisonous liquids. It's a superstitious belief that actually would be carried on for a very long time. Rhino horn did have other uses in civilizations, but I like to think it was a coolness factor. You can't tell me drinking wine out of a hollowed out horn isn't cool, come on. Number 7. Marvin's room. Hey man, it's okay. We've all been there. We all felt that kind of hurt before. You're drunk, it's 3 AM, in a big city with lights. She hurt you bad, dude. But you should just call her. Just see if she picks up. Maybe you shouldn't. Maybe you should get really drunk and then come up with a solution and then see if it still sounds like a solid plan in the morning when you're sober. Yeah, when ancient Persians had a big decision to make, they used dad wisdom. Get super drunk and then think about critical events in life that require tough decision making. And when you're sober in the morning, do it drunk, you thought. Being honest was a big part of Persian culture. And when are people at their most honest? So the theory kind of makes sense to me. I just know that when I wake up in the morning after nurturing a case of beer, that last night's thoughts don't always translate well in the morning. Number 6. The land of milk and honey. Another creative punishment for the people who want to lose sleep tonight. A punishment for crimes Persians had come up with was scapism. This is where the Persians would feed a convicted criminal milk and honey. Sounds awesome, right? Well, not exactly. See, they entrapped the person between two boats, and every day they would force feed someone milk and honey. Milk and honey. Milk and honey. Over and over and over again. Also, slathering the mixture of the two on the poor helpless criminal. As time went on, flies and bugs would find themselves interested in a sweet smelling crook. As one must also use the bathroom after all that beautiful rich consumption. A true horror to see, but after enough time the person who was unlucky enough to be in such a position slowly and painfully died in a bog of their own filth and rodent infested area. Most likely dying of septic shock. I don't even have a joke for this one. This is something that should just be in the next Saw movie. Ugh. Number 5. Ashes to ashes. Here's another fun punishment. Man, these guys are really creative. This one is mentioned in the Bible, so you know it's gonna be good. Basically, the Persians built a tower, and it was filled with ash. Drop criminals into the ash tower, or there were 2 large paddles connected to the turning wheels outside that would churn the ash and victim inside, suffocating on the hot ash, making for a hot and dusty storm of hell and unholy foulness I can't even begin to describe. Like most things in history from this time, it has to be taken with a grain of salt. It could be very true, or not so true, as the Persian Empire did not leave us with much, and most knowledge of them comes from Greeks and Greek historians. But like most stories, there's truth in everything. And if that's even close to the truth, well, that's just not right, man. Number 4. This is Sparta! Despite what a 2006 movie with spray-on abs might mislead you, the Battle of Thermopylae was no laughing matter. It pitted the very brave Spartans against the Persian invaders. And there were a lot of them. Like, really a lot of them. Attack after attack after attack, the Persians were not getting anywhere. It wasn't until one of the Greeks betrayed the Spartans by leaving the Persians on a flank that would result in the destruction of the Spartans. Although the Persians were victorious, it was in a sense a Pyrrhic victory, as the loss of life on the Persian side far outnumbered the deaths of the Spartans. It's a battle that would be remembered for its bravery, and enough to have a movie made about it many, many years later. Number 3. Here comes the boy. So after a failed attack on Greece, Persia was kinda down about that. No money in the treasury meant that the once great Persian Empire was on the decline. So what better time to invade? And that's just what Alexander the Great did. Through a very lengthy campaign that lasted 10 years and a very formidable fighting force, most likely the strongest ever at the time, he shattered the declining Persian Empire. He even managed to capture the city of Babylon. Talk about kicking a guy while he's down. His rule of the Persian Empire unfortunately was short-lived, as he died not too long after that at the ripe old age of 32. Boy, I sure hope I lived to the ripe age of 32. Number 2. The protection of Meow. Before the Persian Empire was no more, they were actually a very powerful empire. So powerful that they wanted a piece of Egypt. This war may have also been started by an insult from the pharaoh, but expanding was probably more likely. What makes this war so notable is the absolute five-head play by Persia. Persia knew of the Egyptian culture and knew about their idolization of cats. So, to aid them in the invasion, the king advised them to use kitty power. Soldiers were painting cats in the god Bastet in order for Egyptians to not dare destroy an image of their god. More ridiculous than that was the use of live cats. Stray cats were rounded up and kept during battle in order to prevent the very lethal arrow fire. Soldiers still died in battle, but it is said that the cats gave enough of an advantage for there to be a Persian victory. Decent. Number 1. Progressive for the time. Looking back in time, we can all acknowledge that maybe we weren't so nice, and as time has moved on, we've gotten more progressive. When you think of ancient empires, you don't really think of progressive, but surprisingly Persia was for the time. Specifically women's rights. Women were free to move about. They were allowed to work and be higher ups and manage. But probably the most important aspect was the right to own business and property, which their European counterparts simply could not do. Look at you, Asian Persia, way to go, look at you! And cold as the wind blows. Japan, we love the people, the food, the culture, and the samurai, cause let's be honest, armored gentlemen of high morals with really sharp swords is just cool. Kublai Khan, being not as cool as Japan, said to himself and his massive ever-growing army, we should go get some cool from Japan. And go to get cool they did. While some initial boat crossings and evasions went okay, two very notable instances where it did not go very well for the Mongol invaders. The worst incident being on August 12, 1281. With a combined fleet of 4,400 ships, over 140,000 Mongol warriors were ready to invade, when seemingly a large typhoon came out of nowhere and devastated the Mongol forces, with at least half of the men drowning and only a few hundred ships remained. Casualties were very high. Those that made it ashore were hunted down by the 40,000 samurai awaiting battle. Shortly after, the typhoon was dubbed the Divine Wind and was thought to be a gift from the gods. Holy for Japan, unholy for the Khan. Number 9. Ninja Vanish. Samurai are distinguished by their colorful leather armor, and katanas that are forged with great care, and a code of honor that was upheld at all costs. But they were not the only warriors of ye olde times in Japan. The ninja needs no introduction, but here it goes anyway. Stealthy warriors cloaked in black who were hired for tactical espionage, and a really weird movie with turtles eating pizza with a rat. They were mercenaries hired by daimyos, and even samurai to get the misdeeds of war done. Sabotage and assassination were necessary in the rebellious and political climate Japan found itself in. It would see many political shifts and leaders fighting for control of a unified and fractured Japan.
At number 8, Ancient WAP. Last year there was a huge scandal concerning Cardi B and Meg Thee Stallion's song WAP. It's a pretty racy song that had a lot of people up in arms about it, and it was all over the news. I mean, if you ever heard any songs from the early 2000s, then you would know that this kind of musical content really isn't a new thing, and school songs have been a part of society for a really long time, but it might surprise you to know that they even had some risque songs even back in the times of ancient Egypt. Historians have discovered some of these songs, one of which I can recite to you, and it uses some pretty imaginative wording to describe a woman's body. In an excerpt from said song, it says, quote, "The one, the sister without peer, the handsomest of all. She looks like the rising morning star. At the start of a happy year, shining bright, fair of skin, lovely the look of her eyes, sweet the speech of her lips, she has not a word too much. Upright neck, shining breast, her hair true lapis lazuli, arms surpassing gold, fingers like lotus buds, heavy thighs, narrow waist, her legs parade her beauty. With graceful steps she treads the ground, captures my heart with her movement." End quote. Now, it's no WAP, but for the ancient Egyptians, it was pretty spicy. At number 7, the Ancient Hub. Back in ancient times, people needed some spicy content to make themselves happy, you know? Before we had OnlyFans and the Hub, people in ancient Egypt had their own adult content to enjoy during their alone time. This piece of content was called the Turin Papyrus, and it was essentially just a scroll of a bunch of images on it with people getting busy in some frankly unimaginable positions. Like, I don't know when the Kama Sutra was created, but I feel like the Turin Papyrus certainly gave it a run for its money. The purpose of this papyrus is pretty much unknown, but there are some theories to explain its origin and why it was created, some thinking that it had political ties or something. Either way, historians use this document to further understand times in ancient Egypt. At number 6, magic attraction. You know, we can't always have the best game when it comes to finding a partner. Sometimes it can be hard to get someone to go out with you. Many people just don't give up until they succeed, and sometimes that means that they will go to many lengths just to get a date with their crush. This was seen a lot in ancient Egypt, and at one point in later years of their civilization, they practiced magic to attract the one that they loved. Turns out that they practiced voodoo to get someone interested in them, and it was commonly done by men seeking out the woman of their dreams. In one case of this voodoo for love practice, a man had a magician make a voodoo doll of a woman that he wanted all to himself. The magician pierced the figurine with bronze nails and inscribed a tablet on it with a spell saying that this woman would not be able to drink, eat, or be with another man besides the one seeking her out. The spell also supposedly summoned a demon to follow her and pull her hair and intestines until she found her way to him. Sounds a little intense, but hey, I guess that's just what you do when you don't have Tinder. At number 5, sneaky link. In ancient Egyptian literature, women were often portrayed as seductresses. One of the more famous stories telling the tale of a seductress is one called the Tale of the Two Brothers. Essentially, the story goes that a man, his wife, and his younger brother all lived together. One day the two men went out to do some farm work, and while they were out, the one man told his brother to go back to the house to get some grain sacks. When he reached the house, the wife noticed the brother and complimented him on his strength and tried to seduce him. The brother got angry and refused, but told the wife that he wouldn't say anything to her husband about their encounter. Still, she was worried that the brother would snitch, and so she made herself look like she had been beaten up, and when her husband returned, she pretended like the brother was the one who tried to seduce her. The husband got angry and threatened to kill his brother, but in an attempt to save his own skin, the brother told the husband the truth and even cut his bits off and threw his pee-pee into the river just to prove his point, where it was promptly eaten by fish. Unfortunate. The husband then returned home to his wife, where he killed her and fed her to dogs. Not a happy ending for anyone, but it gives you a real sense of how adultery worked back in those days. At number 4, no Viagra. Just like anyone else these days, back in ancient Egypt, sometimes people had performance issues. Impotence was apparently a really big issue for many Egyptian men. It was such a common issue that sometimes it infiltrated their art, and there were some scrolls and statues about it. An ancient Egyptian proverb was created about such a topic that said, quote, "He who is shy to have intercourse with his wife will not get any children." Now obviously there are things nowadays that can help with such an issue, but back then people resorted to prayer and magic to help their little buddies out. Don't really know how well that worked out for them, but it's a struggle that a lot of people face, so at least they weren't alone. At number 3, LGBTQ+. As with anywhere on Earth, there were same-sex relationships, and the same goes for ancient Egypt. However, documentation of such things were far and few. The only 100% clear-cut case of same-sex relationships that was documented in ancient Egypt comes from the story of Horus and Seth. The story goes that Horus and Seth were both vying for the throne, and one night Horus pretended to be drunk while Seth tried to take advantage of him while Horus slept. Not the greatest example, but it's what we've got that's actually confirmed. Another potential recorded gay relationship may have come from Egypt's King Pepu II, who was thought to have had a secret relationship with one of his generals at nighttime. One of the most well-known potential gay relationships from those times, though, comes from a piece of Egyptian art that showed two men touching noses. Doesn't seem like anything too intimate, but back then touching noses was another way of kissing. The two men depicted, though, were thought to be brothers, so it's theorized that there was something a little spicy going on there, but we don't have to think about that one too hard. At number 2, dirty insults. What is your favorite insult? Don't be shy, you can tell me, this is a safe space. I guess I have a number of favorites, but one that I quite enjoy is saying that someone's mother is a horker, like in Skyrim. Back in the times of ancient Egypt, however, insults often included some kind of note. If they needed to hurl an insult at someone, they might say something like, quote, "May you copulate with a donkey," or "May a donkey copulate with your wife." People would also combine some kind of note with pointing out someone's flaws to create an insult. In a note found from one of the people who built one of the Great Pyramids, they insulted one of their co-builders by saying, quote, You are not a man because you cannot get your wives pregnant like your fellow men. Like, damn. That's pretty cool, dude. And finally, at number 1, the magic pee-pee. Now, I had to save this next fact for our number 1 spot because it's probably one of the most bizarre things that I've ever learned about ancient Egypt. The Egyptian god Min was the male fertility god, and let's just say that he was quite unique. He was known for his bold feathered headdress and the fact that his loincloth snake was always being charmed, if you get what I'm saying. Men suffering from impotence would make offerings to him to help them with their fertility problems. Even to this day, figures of the god Min are used in magic rites. Men and women still visit the ancient temples to find figures of the god and literally rub his to overcome their problems. Sounds strange, but apparently so many people have done it that the stone that it's carved into has become worn down or darkened from how many hands have touched it. Now I can only imagine what this god's body count was.